Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead and grab some victuals, sit down, make yourself comfortable, and welcome to Accuracy in Academia's Authors Night, our first one of the year. We try to do these more regularly, but we'll be back on schedule soon, along with the kitchen. And this is brought to you by a generous grant from the Fusco Foundation, which is supporting our Conservative University series. This is where we try to bring you the authors, the books. Can everybody hear me in the back okay? Okay. That you're not likely to get on campus. And I really feel for you, that folks that are still in school, and some of the books that you do get on campus. But today is a special night because it's Constitution Day, the tail end of Constitution Day, September 17th. And that's why we're looking at the topic, are we outsourcing the U.S. Constitution? Those of us who've tried to follow this, have seen numerous references from Supreme Court justices and law school professors to the need to start looking at international law. And some of us of a certain vintage look at this and say, why? Where did this come from? What for? Well, our speaker here tonight is going to try to answer that, and he's quite the person to. At Accuracy in Academia, as our name implies, we try to keep track of what's going on campus, what professors are saying, what they're teaching, and quite frankly, we get to cover too many ersatz scholars, so we really know the real thing when we see it, and our speaker tonight definitely fits the bill. We were alternatively going to call this this talk, Dude, Where's My Sovereignty? In fact, we wanted a speaker on this topic, and when you get to the question of law school professors who know about national sovereignty, or know that it exists at least, it's a very narrow margin. And when you get to those who really know and understand it, you get to our speaker tonight. Jeremy Rabkin. I had the privilege of seeing him speak at a luncheon earlier this year, and he's got a wonderful lecture in Imprimis, the Hillsdale College newsletter. I should also mention, while I'm doing public service announcements, that we'll have another one of these on November 5th, very possibly in this same room. Hi, Irene, how you doing? Good. We're real informal here. Anyway, that will feature Steve Hayward, who is also a past speaker of ours, but he's written a wonderful new book, The Age of Reagan, which is probably the definitive book we've seen so far on the Reagan years. It's just a masterpiece. One thing he did that relates to what we're talking about here tonight is that he went and tallied the references to the Constitution in the memoirs of Presidents Carter, Clinton, Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. And the score was Reagan 10, everybody else collectively nothing. But to help tell us, since we've got so many international accords going and such a fondness for international law, and the only references we see to the Constitution are usually attached to a picture with it behind a glass, to help tell us how we got here, how we got there, where it's coming from, where it's going, tall order, I know, but you can do it, is a gentleman it's been my pleasure to meet this year, from George Mason University, directly to the National Press Club, Dr. Jeremy Rabkin.
I think the first time I spoke about this in Washington was about 10 years ago. This UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Social, Cultural, they have this treaty that they don't administer it, they hover over it. But anyway, this treaty that establishes a list of World Heritage Sites. You get to be on the list, and they say you're on the list. And they had put Yellowstone Park on the list. We had said, oh, Yellowstone Park, that's great, that should be a World Heritage Site. Yes. And apparently, along with being on the list, they have people who come and inspect. So they had people from UNESCO who came to Montana to look, is that right? Wyoming, Idaho, wherever it is. I mean, it's in at least 2 states, right? Wyoming and Idaho, someone here knows? Anyway, so they looked and they said, you know, actually you're not doing enough to protect the park, and now that it's a World Heritage Site, you should really take better care of it. And so they made various recommendations, and somehow people in, wherever it was, Montana, heard about it and became really outraged. And this story started going around. This was really before the internet, but people had still ways of communicating. And so there was this kind of underground network of stories about UNESCO is going to take over the Yellowstone Park. And people became fixated on this idea that the UN was going to send black helicopters, which would seize control. And everybody was very worked up about this, and so somebody asked me to write something. I wrote something about it, and then I was invited to these hearings that they had at the House of whatever it was, Energy and Commerce Committee, anyway, some House committee here. And the Congresswoman, as she then was, from Idaho, Helen Chenoweth. Anyone know that name?
Idaho, yeah.
Idaho, right. And I had said in my testimony, you know, this is not about black helicopters, and you don't have to worry about black helicopters seizing one of our national parks to think that there are serious issues here. And Helen Chenoweth said at the beginning of the hearing, Professor Rabkin, I see whether you've talked about the black helicopters. I was really interested in that. And I said, well, yes, I mean, people are really being a little crazy about this, and that's not really what you're worried about. Yes, I was very interested in those black helicopters. So after a minute, and she said, my constituents are very concerned about it. I said, the Montana militia? But you're all too young and you've never heard of the Montana militia. Well, we used to be concerned about the Montana militia, but she pointed out she was from Idaho, so this got lost. But there are people who have somewhat crazed ideas about threats to our sovereignty. And I want to just emphasize to you, as I tried to explain to Congresswoman Chenoweth, I'm not worried about the black helicopters. The reason I'm not worried about the black helicopters is one thing that we are equipped to do is to shoot them down. And the Pentagon would like to do that. That is something they know how to do. You aim them at a target, they will shoot, and the park will be safe. What I am concerned about is that people become distracted and confused and lacking in self-confidence, and people keep bringing up, oh, international law, oh, it's international law, international law, international law, and people react to that as if, oh, well, are we going to jail? Is the president going to jail? So my main aim is to restore the confidence that a previous generation of Americans had when international law was mentioned, and they said, what are you talking about? I think it is useful to have international law. I don't mean to dismiss all of it, but what it ought to be is agreements among states which we will observe if the other signatories observe. Right? So I'll give a few examples of this as I go through, but we did not have a lot of litigation about treaties until recently, because most treaties were regarded as something for the president and the State Department in the course of diplomacy to cajole the other signatories to, come on now guys, we promised and you promised and let's do this. We are now getting to a point where people think that international treaties and things that aren't even treaties, that are just international understandings, should be taken up by American courts, as they're taken up by courts in other countries. And that, I think, is worrisome. And even more worrisome is understanding maybe in Congress, and for sure in executive departments and in the Pentagon, that, oh, well, no, we have to because there's... If this starts infiltrating into our understanding of what our own legal system is, then we have really begun to lose our status as a sovereign country. Not because black helicopters will take over, but just because we're like disoriented and confused, or what are we allowed to do? Let me cite three general areas where I'm worried about this, that are good illustrations of the sort of range of things that are affected. And let me start with regulatory issues, many of which are quite technical and not in themselves perhaps so scary, but it would be a change if international regulatory standards could be made for us without our consent. Or, which is close to that, our consent is expressed by some guy who is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State or Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce, goes to a meeting and says, okay, and then that becomes American law. We have been pretty careful up until now about not signing treaties which set up international agencies that have the authority to do things, but there are a couple of examples of sort of ambiguous cases. I'll give you one. We have this treaty on protecting the ozone layer, which you probably have heard about. People thought that certain kinds of chemicals were reacting with oxygen and thinning the ozone layer. You all look so young. That's really charming. In the 80s, people were concerned about this, so we set up this treaty, and for a while everyone talked about it, but then we moved on. But the treaty is still there. And what they've been doing is saying, no, we need to cut down on our use of methyl bromide even more than we thought, and we need to do it more quickly than we thought. And the way they've been doing this is all the signatories to the treaty, we are among them, will have a meeting and basically show of hands saying, all right, let's do this. We had a case just 2 years ago. The EPA said, well, we're going to impose this new standard in the United States because it was agreed to by the treaty partners in this meeting. Right? It was not a treaty that went to the Senate. It was not even a treaty signed by the president. It was just people who were parties to a treaty, that is, countries that were parties to a treaty, in effect said, well, and we can revise it as we go along by a show of hands. D.C. Court of Appeals said, come on, this can't be right, because if this is right, that the EPA is allowed to change its standards because of this international meeting, that is basically saying that Congress can delegate its legislative authority not just to the EPA, but to 100 countries that show up for meetings in wherever they happen to be meeting that year. They usually meet in places that people like to go to, like, you know, Switzerland, Singapore, someplace fun. But that would be a change for us if our law could be made by international conferences. I'm not saying it would be immediately terrible, but it would really change things. The way it is now, the EPA has probably too much discretion over too many things, but the EPA administrator has to be confirmed by the Senate. Their budget has to be approved by Congress. You can haul them in and question them. They're subject to litigation in American courts, and none of those things apply to a conference of 100 diplomats meeting somewhere. So this would be a change. We have done very little of this, but the question is, could we do more of it? And exactly where we would do it, I believe, is in one of the areas in the environmental field, because you have very, very ambitious environmental treaties. People now talking about we're going to stop global warming by controlling energy use. Well, that's a pretty ambitious project. If you're serious about that, you're going to have a lot of detailed regulations as you want to adjust and change, so you have the prospect of something like an international EPA. That would be disturbing. That would be a big change. Let me give you a second example. National security powers. Congress is given in the Constitution the power to declare war. The president is commander-in-chief. We've always assumed that that meant that the decision of whether we go to war or not is basically our decision. People say no. A lot of people say, I would say most law professors say, oh no, that's changed with the UN Charter. The UN Charter requires that you cannot go to war unless you have the approval of the Security Council, or unless you're actually invaded. And even then, you should just resist until the Security Council comes in and says what to do. I do not believe that the Senate, when it ratified the UN Charter in 1945, actually understood that that's what they were agreeing to. For sure, that is not the way the world has worked in 60 years since then. We've had in those 60 years something like 150 wars, depending on how you count it. But the people who are counting up to 150 were not counting every little incident of lobbing off, rockets here or there. There's been a lot of wars in the world, and hardly any of them, in fact, only 2 of them were authorized by the Security Council. So the world doesn't work this way. The actual practice of nations is not this way. To say this is what the Charter means, you basically have to say it means this because a lot of law professors say so, and it doesn't actually matter that much what the governments actually do. It matters what the law professors say. Well, that's like a curious view of international law. You might think that I am exaggerating or giving you a kind of comic parody, but actually people defend this view of international law. That is, international law is accepted norms and standards which don't necessarily have to correspond to how governments actually behave. Let me give you an example that we're all familiar with, or should be if you like to read newspapers. We've spent the last however many years it is, 3, 4, 5, 8, arguing about the detainees at Guantanamo. And the International Red Cross has insisted all along they are prisoners of war, and if you don't treat them as prisoners of war, you have to indict them and give them ordinary criminal due process. The position of the Bush administration always was, and in fact the position of the Obama administration sort of kind of half-heartedly is, well, no, not quite. That is, they don't, even the Obama people are not actually quite treating them as prisoners of war. But they are reacting very, very defensively, the Obama people are, and the reason they're reacting defensively is so many people have been persuaded that, oh no, this is against international law, and this is against international law. How do we know this? Because the International Committee of the Red Cross said so. If you look around at all the conflicts that we've had in the world, since we've had the Geneva Conventions in 1949, there are hardly any of these conflicts in which these standards have been properly respected, and there are none in which they have been actually upheld or observed in relation to terrorists and guerrilla fighters. So this is an interpretation of Geneva Conventions and international law, which is based on what? And fundamentally, it's based on what professors think would be reasonable and what people in Geneva, who are not governments, they're not elected by governments. The International Committee of the Red Cross is elected by, I don't know, Red Cross chapters. This is what they think sort of ought to be international law. And just, I mean, you've all seen this, how intimidating that is. And people are like, oh, whoa, violating international law. So their view of international law is it just can develop apart from treaties by kind of custom, and the custom can be not actually what governments do, but what commentators say about it. If that is right, then it means we have to really worry about, gosh, I mean, can we make our own decisions about war and peace? I'll give you one other example just in this area. There's this thing, the International Criminal Court. The United States was involved in negotiations to set it up, and then it turned out differently than we had expected, and we said, no. Under Clinton, no, we can't join this. One of the things that they set out to do with the treaty establishing the International Criminal Court was to specify, now these are the most serious international crimes. War crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. And one of the things they wanted to put there was aggression. They thought, yeah, that's an international crime because the Nazi leaders were tried for conspiracy to commit aggression, so that's something that we always do. By always, they mean once. It's not true. We did it to some Japanese also, so twice. But in both cases, it was countries totally defeated in war, and this was basically organized by the victors. I said, no, no, no. In the future, we have to have an international body that can say, you have committed aggression. Now, they couldn't agree on how to define that in 1998. If you think about it, it's rather hard to define, because what you mean by aggression was, you were wrong. You were not entitled to use force in this case. Well, how about if you were threatened? How about if you were attacked? How about if something else happened, hostages were held? I mean, there are a lot of situations which you might use force. They are now proposing to go ahead and try and get international agreement on a definition. And it is not impossible that we could see in coming years an American president indicted. Now, we wouldn't turn him over for trial to this court in The Hague, but I think it would be very rattling to people. I mean, it wouldn't be rattling to me, but I think it would be rattling probably to a president and to his staff. For sure, the future Rahm Emanuel would be thinking, oh, no, no, don't do that. You might be indicted. That'll look terrible. How will we explain that to the press? Okay, the easy way to explain that to the press is this is an attack on American sovereignty, which is completely wrong. We did not agree to this institution. We did not ratify its treaty. So they are just calling us names, and we should be able to defend ourselves. I just ask you all, you have probably as much sense as I do of, how do people react and how do newspapers report things. Would future presidents have the self-confidence to say, cut it out, this is ridiculous? I'm not sure. I think they would worry about it, and therefore, in effect, we are delegating to this body, which is, who are they? I mean, there are a bunch of people you never heard of on this court, and they're from the usual UN system of we need one from Africa, we need one from Asia, we need two from here and from there. These people are going to tell us when we can and can't use force. Whoa, that's a real big change in the world. Let me just briefly mention a third thing that is in a way less dramatic, but for that reason probably we will see much more of it, and that is the Supreme Court has started referring to foreign court decisions in interpreting the United States Constitution. You probably heard about these cases. There were two of them about capital punishment. Is it constitutional to have the death penalty for someone who is 17 but not 18? Is it constitutional to have the death penalty for someone who is supposed to be of subnormal intelligence? I mean, mentally retarded. Well, you can argue about this, but the court in both of these cases said, well, we have said earlier that this was constitutional, I mean, not that long ago, but come to think of it, we noticed that the European Court of Human Rights, dealing with a different treaty, which has no bearing on us, we're not a party to it anyway, but they've said that it's wrong to execute people who are under 18. They've said it's wrong to execute people who are mentally retarded. Actually, we've noticed the Supreme Court of Canada, the Supreme Court of South Africa, they went around gathering all these things. Now, this was all pretty misleading. What the EU and the European Court of Human Rights have actually said is capital punishment is wrong all the time in all circumstances. It's not actually interesting what they say about the mentally retarded. They're not actually talking about the mentally, they're just kidding. They submitted a brief to us saying, but it's interesting that they submitted a brief. The European Union went to the trouble of, in effect, intervening in an American court case, which didn't involve a European. They just weigh in. We're concerned that America still has capital punishment for mentally retarded people. We're concerned that America still has capital punishment for people who are under 18, because that's against what we think of as an international norm. And we think it is an international norm because someone said this at the UN and someone said that somewhere else. The one thing that actually looks like law to a normal lawyer is there is this treaty, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States is a party to, which does actually say you shouldn't execute people under the age of 18. When we ratified, the Senate said, not that one. We don't agree to that. So what's happened here is people are saying, well, that doesn't really matter. I mean, you just said that. But the important thing is there's an evolving global norm. Oh, well, if there's an evolving global norm and we have to accommodate our Constitution to it, we're really living in a different world. And I am not, again, saying this means global tyranny. But it does mean, instead of saying, this treaty we can't have because it's against our Constitution. Let me just give you a clear-cut example. The Senate, when it ratified this human rights treaty, This happened under Bush, I mean the previous Bush, early 90s. They said, oh, you know, most of this stuff is good. We're for free speech, we're for religious freedom, we're for due process, we're for all this stuff. But you have here this thing that says the governments should suppress hate speech and propaganda for war. And we cannot do that as the United States because we have a First Amendment which doesn't allow us to suppress bad speech. So we'll ratify this treaty, but with certain exceptions, certain stipulations, the actual technical term is reservations. Everything, yes, except these things that we've reserved. And one of them was the free speech stuff. Well, the logic of the situation now is that we should in future be saying not, is this treaty in conflict with our Constitution, but is our Constitution in conflict with this treaty, and not just an actual treaty, but with this amorphous, evolving global norms. And if it is,